This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so where are we? So what are we really doing out here is that we have discussed about the Azure repository, and then we discussed about, just to give a quick recap of everything that we're doing right now, is that we have discussed about the Azure repository as such, and then we have discussed about something like how can developers, basically push the code into the repository using something like git commands like git commit, git clone, git push, and all that stuff. And we have used like something like a Visual Studio, basically console out here. Like we have used a Visual Studio code, and then we basically went ahead and did all those operations out here. And after the code is committed, we said, you know what, there is like, something known as a pipeline concept in Azure, where you can go ahead and, let's say, create a pipeline, and then basically you have, something like a pipeline getting triggered and all that stuff. And then we also said that, you know what, we have something called as a validation concept in place. Like you don't have to do basically a validation every time. There is something known as an automated validator called, or in the form of something known as a sonar cube, or a sonar cloud, or a sonar in short, which will go ahead and give a complete, or which will go ahead and do a complete static code analysis. And after that, you will have something called as a build pipeline getting triggered, and at the end of it you will have something like called as an artifact that is, getting produced out. You have something known as an artifact that is being, produced out in the form of a zip file. Now artifact is nothing but binaries, DLLs, and all that stuff, which we said, okay, fine, we have binaries and DLLs. Now we'll be taking this particular binary, we'll be taking this particular DLL, and we'll be releasing it out on an environment in Azure. For that, what I'll do is like I'll just start over this again. So I'll just say I'll basically implement something known as a continuous integration out here. So let me see if we have a continuous integration out here. So I'll say, okay, fine. So this is continuous integration already enabled. And there is a, okay, fine. Fine. I'll take this particular thing. I'll say Azure pipelines. And I will basically take something known as a VS 2017 built on 2016 server. And I'll just say save. And I'll say change to the Azure pipeline agent. So some comment out here, and I'll just say save. And now what I'm going to do is like I'll come down to the repository out here, and I won't trigger this pipeline manually. I'll rather let my repository trigger it. So I'll basically do what? I'll basically pull a feature branch from my develop branch. So I'll say feature 3 or 400. I'll say create. Now what I'm going to do is like I'll just go into this particular folder and web application framework, and I'll just play, basically I'll edit something into this particular folder called, I'll just come into home. I'll just come into index, and in index this is how it look like the code. This is how it's going to actually look like, right? So what I'll just do is like I'll just edit this out, and it says okay, fine, this is great. I'll just take everything out, and in the paragraph I'll say this is the version 1.0 of the ASP.NET application released from Azure DevOps. Something for my understanding. And I'll say commit. So the developer is doing, let's say, a commit out here. He's giving something like, updated the index.html, and he's doing a commit. And post commit, the developer is now saying, okay, fine, the code is working fine. I'll just go ahead and create a pull request so that the code gets merged into the develop branch. So I'll say create a pull request. And now I'll basically take this code and hit it to the develop branch out here. So in here, the files are one, like this is the, one comment that I did, and I just edited the existing code. And now I can say, go ahead and create a pull request. Okay, what happened just again? Let's see. Okay, I'm not sure why it wasn't created. Let's do this again. Let's go to develop, and let's say create. And now the PR is like, kind of created out. And I'll just do an approve of this PR so that, the check is there. And I'll say set to autocomplete and delete the feature branch after the merge is done. And here, if you see, the validator is kind of triggered, and it's like already continuing to do a build job out here, where it is like going ahead and integrate. I mean, triggering out the sonar out there and doing a full code analysis. So let's give it a minute or two, and this is how the process is actually going to be, guys. So we are right now into a continuous integration process, where as and when you trigger something out there, like as and when you do a a trigger out there, automatically it's going to trigger, let's say, the sonar. And after the sonar is complete and after the code is merged, meaning after the pull request is actually merged into the develop branch, you should have a continuous integration trigger, or a basically a CI pipeline getting triggered out there. So this is the pull request, and right now it's like checking the validator for. And once this is done, you should have another pipeline getting triggered, which is this particular pipeline that I'm talking about. Now this is a full code validator which is like actually running, and after this, you should have the ASP.NET full framework application pipeline that is getting triggered. So let's wait for this to happen, and once this is done, let's go ahead and see how this pipeline gets triggered, and let's go ahead and see how our artifact really looks like. Okay, where are we till here? Okay, this should be done in a minute. And now it's like running the code analyzer, so it's like validated that what the integration is right and all that stuff. And I'm using an Azure pipeline agent in order to, let's say, avoid the wastage of time. So I haven't created an Azure, or I haven't created, let's say, a self-hosted agent. I'm just using, let's say, a pipeline agent basically in order to see, or in order to basically run this particular code. But did you all get the concept of the self-hosted agent, guys? Any questions there? Any questions in there with the self-hosted agents? Did you all happen to try? Did you all get that out? Anyone, guys? Okay, so let's wait for. Yeah.
Arjun,
Hmm?
so
Sir.
now we are creating a PR
Yes.
request to
Hmm?
get continuous integration to work. So
Hmm.
suppose a developer is pushing the code from the somewhere else, like visual code, directly
Hmm.
pushing to the development branch. So the CI will work in that scenario.
Firstly, you won't be able to push it to the development branch. Reason being, your development branch already has a lot of policies on top of it. So you won't be, or the concept of this is like you're not allowing anyone to do a direct commit. Now your
Okay,
development
right.
branch has a lot of policies, right? So they won't be able to push it to the development branch at all. Like there is no way that they will be able to achieve this out.
Okay.
But
So
if there was, let's say, like, yeah, but just in case if there was something like that where you are allowed to directly push to the develop branch, it would still go ahead and trigger a pipeline. It would have still gone ahead and triggered a pipeline out there. So now you have the ASP, basically, this particular pipeline got triggered, which is your CI pipeline, which is giving you the artifact. So in this scenario, especially when the developer is trying to commit something onto the develop branch directly, they'll simply be thrown an error using Visual Studio Code and all. Anywhere they come from, it'll simply throw an error telling that it's a git fatal error. You are not allowed to directly commit onto the develop branch because this branch has a PR, this branch has policies. I expect you to basically do a commit onto this branch using a PR. That's what you are indirectly telling, let's say, the developers using your policies. Does that answer your question, Chandra? Does that answer your question, Chandra? Sorry. Okay, fine. So I have a artifact right now. Now this is where we are, and we said the CI pipeline has kind of produced an artifact which is like in a form of a zip file, which I want to now use in order to basically release it out on an Azure environment on a web app that is running in an Azure environment without having to touch the web app at all. Right now, if you look at the Azure portal that I am on right now, I have basically an applications. I have like two different applications out here. One being East US, two. I mean, the one being running in East US and the other being in North Europe. So I'd like to go ahead and let's say I release my application. Let's say now, right now, the application is running on an HTML page. Like this is the East US 2 application, and this is running, let's say, on an HTML page. I'd like to release my code on top of this. So what I'll do is I'll come back to Azure DevOps and I'll say in pipelines, go to something known as a release pipeline. In here, what I'll do is I'll say create a new release pipeline and let's call this as a code release pipeline. I'll say empty job, not a problem. I'll say code release ASP.NET full framework. And I will say this is a testing stage, something like this. And now it's asking me, can you please add an artifact to it? Like I know that you want to use a release pipeline to basically manage your artifacts. Now can you please go ahead and add an artifact to it? I'll say okay, fine, I'll add an artifact and I will say my artifacts are actually coming from a build pipeline in Azure, and this is the only project that I have called Terraform. So this is the project, and my artifact should be coming from something known as a pipeline known as ASP.NET Full Framework Pipeline, because this is what my pipeline is. And always take the latest artifact. Whatever is the latest artifact that is available out there, please take that. And I'll say add. So the second step is to add an artifact. And after the addition of artifact, it's now telling there are complete stages out here. So there is one stage called as testing stage out here. And in testing stage, what I want to do is I just want to test my artifact on top of, let's say, an Azure web. And inside this, you again have an agent job which is running basically on an Azure pipeline. You can also use, let's say, your default pipeline, your self-hosted pipeline, your self-hosted agents also can be integrated here. Now what I'm doing is like I'm saying, okay, fine, I'll add something like a task, and this task should do one thing very simple. It should take the artifact and it should release on an Azure web application. So I'll just type in something called Azure web app deploy, or let's say Azure. I'll just type web and it says Azure web app, and this is the task that I'm interested into, Azure app service deploy. I'll say add. It says I need some attention out here. I'll say okay, fine, please deploy on top of an Azure application service. Now one very important thing out here is that this is Azure DevOps is a software as a service. Azure is also a software as a service. Two different things. You're dealing with two different things out here. So it's asking me which Azure subscription you want to basically release your code to. Let's try looking at this. And I have like one particular subscription out here called Pay As You Go. And I can say authorize. And I can give my ID, I can give my password, and I can authorize this out. Straightforward. I can either come with this particular authorization. But see, we want to implement something known as a continuous release process, meaning whenever there is a developer who's like committing your code, they should be able to basically, after the code is merged into the develop branch, they should be able to get a continuous integration pipeline triggered, produce an artifact, and then automatically release the code. But isn't this a manual step? Isn't this something which is blocking me out here to go ahead and give the user ID, give the password, and all that stuff? And also, this is not a great option to basically go ahead and authenticate to your Azure subscription. That is where Azure DevOps very well integrates with Azure. And I want to establish a connection between two different software as a services. One being the Azure portal, because I want to basically release my code on top of the Azure portal using something like Azure DevOps. I'll say ADO, using something known as an Azure DevOps. And the process of establishing or the process of connecting these two things is known as a service connection. Meaning I now want to establish something known as a service connection between the Azure portal and the DevOps portal and the DevOps side of things. This is what I want to right now establish out. And please listen carefully, guys. The establishment of service principle or the establishment of a service connection is a bit tricky, meaning you will have a couple of steps in order to take this out. So please do stop me whenever there is a bit of confusion. So what I'm going to do out here is that I'll say, okay, fine. This is not what it is. Like I want to establish something known as a service connection to my Azure portal. And I'll say, go to the project settings. The first thing I'm doing is I'm going to the project settings on the Azure DevOps side of things. And I'm going to something known as a service connections out here. This is what I want to, kind of check out. And I'll say, I want a new service connection. And it's saying, okay, fine, what kind of a service connection do you want? Like, do you want to deploy your code on AWS? Or do you have something known as a team foundation server? Or do you want to do it on, let's say, GCP and any external cloud as such? I know that my cloud is like Azure, so I basically take something known as an Azure Resource Manager. And I'll say next. Now it's telling what kind of authorization method that you want to basically go ahead with. I have a couple of things. And now I'll say I need something known as a service principal. This is a concept of service principal, and please choose manual. Don't go for automatic because automatic still works, but you will not understand what the concept really is. I'll choose something known as service principal manual and I'll just next. Now it's asking me, okay, fine. Can you please give me certain details like this? Like what your Azure cloud is, what is your subscription, and all that stuff. Now what I'll do is like I'll go to my Azure cloud. Firstly, I need what? A subscription ID. So I'll go to my Active Directory and it has all the tenant ID and all that stuff. Even before that, I'll just come down to my subscription and I'll just basically go into this particular subscription called Pay As You Go and I'll take the subscription ID. That's it. I'll just pick up the subscription ID and I'll go and I'll give the subscription ID here. And subscription name, I'll say just say it is a Pay As You Go subscription. And now it's telling me what is your service principal ID, what is your service principal key. Two things out here. This is where a concept of service principal comes into picture. Now, for authenticating applications, meaning for authenticating external applications into Azure, you need something known as a service principal out here. A service principal is an object of Azure Active Directory. Inside Azure Active Directory, now we have seen that you can register users and give them different levels of access, right? Like owner, contributor, reader, and all that stuff. This is one of the purposes of Active Directory. In the same way, you can also register something known as an applications. These applications that are registered in the Azure Active Directory can be used to authenticate third parties like Azure DevOps. Now I'm talking Azure DevOps as a third party because this is another software as a service. Or authentication of applications like Jenkins, Octopus, Kubernetes, Docker, whatever it is that you can think of. Meaning, if you want to establish an authentication between Azure and another third-party service, like let's say Azure DevOps in my case, I need to create something known as a service principal in Azure. How do I do that? Firstly, I'll go into something known as an Azure Active Directory. Under Azure Active Directory, instead of creating a user, I'll create something known as an app registration. And I'll say new application registration. And I'll say this is DevOps integration. I'll just say new because I already have an app registration. So I'll just say new out here. and I'll just take all the options out here. I'm not even giving anything out here. I'll just say register. This is going to create something called as an app registration out here. Meaning, if I basically take this app registration, it has something known as an application client ID, object ID, tenant ID, and all that stuff. If I take this particular app registration, and if I, let's say, go into any of the resource groups, and if, let's say, I go into the identity and access control management, like the IAM portal of it, and if I try to add a role assignment right now, I can select, let's say, something like an owner role. And here, if you see, it's saying users, groups, or service principal. So you can assign access to users, you can assign access to groups, you can also assign access to something known as a service principal, and this will start getting reflected something like this. I just typed in the name and I have a service principal out here, meaning I can assign access not only on users, but I can also I can assign access on top of applications also, and then use the applications onto an external portal. So what I'm going to do is, like, I'll again come back, let's say, to my app registrations out here, and I'll just go into the app registration page, and this is the new DevOps integration, right? So I'll just go into it, and it has something known as an application ID or a client ID. I'll just copy this out. Let's go into the settings, and it's asking me for a service principal ID. The service principal ID is the same as the application ID or a client ID that you are seeing right now in the Azure DevOps side of things. Application ID, client ID, or the service principal ID is the same. Now it's asking me for a service principal key. How do I authenticate this? Do you have a key or do you have a certificate? I'll say, since I'm a very small user, I want to generate a key, and this is what it is. It's called a key. Secrets and keys. I'll just go to I'll just go to certificates and secrets, and I'll say add a new client secret, and I'll say this is a test client secret, and I can basically give an expiration to it. Like right now, it's at 6 months, so I'll just drill it down to 3 months, and I'll say add. So add a client secret, and this is the value. I'll copy this value and paste it in a notepad out here. Like a pat token, even once you refresh this out, the client secret will kind of get it'll be hidden out here. The client secret is now hidden. You cannot see this client secret again. You have to delete it and create a new one. Until then, you won't be able to see something out here. So I'll take this client secret, and I'll now basically go into my setting, and I'll basically give the client key out here. That's it. And now it's asking me something known as a tenant ID. So I'll go into my app registration. Into the overview page, I get the tenant ID out here. Just call tenant ID, the directory ID, whatever it is, and I'll paste it out here. And now, as and when I click on verify, it's saying okay fine, verifying and all that stuff, and it's saying okay fine, you know what, I failed this particular client ID. Now if you look at the failure message out here, it's saying okay fine, I tried to hit something known as this particular Azure subscription using something known as an external API called Microsoft something 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 with a client ID something like this, and I tried to basically send a response, meaning I tried to basically give something known as an authorization out here, but I kind of failed out here because this particular service principal what you kind of created doesn't have an access onto the Azure portal. Meaning what it's trying to talk about out here is that you have created a service principal which is good, but did you assign any access to the service principal onto your Azure subscription? No. By default, will you have any access? No. This is just like a user which just got created in the Azure Active Directory but has no access whatsoever. So what I'll do is, like, I'll say okay fine, since it doesn't have any access, I'll go ahead and assign it an access, and I'll assign it an access at a subscription level, not as a resource group level, because I want this particular service principal and I want my Azure DevOps basically to go ahead and deploy to any resource group as such. So I'll go into the subscription level and I'll go into the identity and access management out here, and I'll say add a role assignment, and I'll give it, let's say, a role of an owner. I'll say basically take a role of an owner, and I'll search for this particular service principal out here. I'll say save. So I am making this particular service principal as an owner to this particular pay-as-you-go subscription, meaning I am assigning it a role assignment out here so that this error doesn't come up. This error basically doesn't come up. So I'll again basically try to do a verification out here. Okay, I'll just basically close this out. I'll say no. I'll say new service connection again, because you'll have to do it afresh again. So I'll just basically take this out. I'll say service principal. Next, I'll again take this subscription ID and all that stuff. I'll just say just pay as you go. And I'll just take the service principal ID back again. So I'll just go into my Active Directory and take the service principal ID, take the service principal key, which I basically copied on my notepad. So this is the DevOps integration. I'll just take the service principal ID, paste it out here, service principal key, and the tenant ID. Now I again try to do a verification out here, and now the verification is successful. The verification is only successful because the service principal has something known as a right on top of your subscription. If the service principal doesn't have an access on top of your subscription, no matter how many times you try to do a verification, it will kind of fail. Because for Azure DevOps to basically do anything on your Azure subscription, the service principal that you are giving the Azure subscription, the service principal basically that you are integrating with your Azure DevOps, needs to have few read and write accesses. That's what I gave it out there. And now I'll say this is deployment new, and I'll say verify and save. And this is very important. Just click on this option called grant access to all the pipelines, so that this particular service connection that you're creating can now go ahead and, let's say, interact with all the pipelines that you're creating. And I'll say okay, fine, verify and save. So it's a deployment new basically that I went ahead and created out, and I'll say basically verify and save this out. And now what I'm going to do right now is that I'll just come to my release pipeline, and here let me close this out, and let me refresh this a couple of times, and let me click this drop down out here. Okay, come on, let me go here and let me click this drop down again. And here you find something known as a service connection called deployment underscore new. Now it doesn't ask you for something known as an authorization, because now your deployments or now your pipelines are making use of something called as a service principal that was created on the Azure portal, and you have basically allowed the authentication to it. Post creation of this, I'll say yes, this is a web app that is basically that I want it on a Windows, because this is an ASP.NET Full Framework application. And now it's asking you what is the app service name. As in when you click the drop down out here, since the service principal has access on all the resource groups, it's now showing me that, you know what, your entire subscription has two different application services. And I'll select this particular East US Web Application ABC. This is the application service that I want to select. And here it's asking me, what do you want to deploy? I'll select yes, I want to deploy a zip package, and that zip package is like coming from this particular artifact into the drop location, and this is called some web application framework.zip. This is what I want to actually go ahead and, let's say, deploy on top of the application. And you have a couple of options like what is the deployment method and all that stuff. So this is something that I don't want to really do a lot. I mean, I don't want to really fiddle around with this, because all this is like good enough. And let's see, do I want anything else? Let's see. Okay, continue on error, which is okay, which is fine. This is I don't need a post deployment action, additional deployment options. I'll select web application deploy, and I'll say remove additional files at the destination. I'll just select this out, and I actually do not need to select this out, but just in case, I mean, sometimes the additional files in the application that are already there that won't be basically edited, I mean, that won't be deleted out. So I'm just selecting this one out, and you can select something like zip deploy also, even that can kind of work. But for now I'll just select a web deploy, and I'll just say remove additional files at the destination, and I'll just give it a save, and I'll say this is a release pipeline. I'll say my first release pipeline, and I'll say okay. So I am taking the artifact that is getting produced out from a CI pipeline, and I am attaching it to a release pipeline so that I can deploy it on top of an Azure web application that is running in the Azure portal. I'll just say create, and now it's asking me, okay, fine, which stage is it that you want to kind of go ahead and create the release to. I'll say I want to create a release to the test stage, and I'll say create, and this has created a first release out here, and this release right now is like kind of queued. And if I look into the logs of this, it's now got an Azure DevOps agent, and now it'll simply download all the code, meaning it'll simply download all the artifact and then try to deploy it on top of the Azure web app that I have in the portal. So if I give it a refresh a couple of times out here, you'll be able to see how the deployment actually kind of works out. So it might take a bit of time basically to begin with, like 1 or 2 minutes basically, because this is running on an Azure pipeline hosted agent. So it's an Azure hosted agent, so it might be a bit slow in order to begin your deployments and all that stuff. So let's give it a minute. Guys, any questions till here? Anything that I can take till here while the release is going on? Anything, guys?
So when we are releasing, we need a existing running web app on the DevOps, sorry, Azure.
We do, yes.
So
Otherwise, you won't be able to release.
cannot we create new one, and it won't create,
Uh,
right? DevOps release won't create any new web app, so it will use existing one only.
there is a way to create it out. Like there is certainly a way to create it out. Like in order to cut down the cost, you can basically do that. That's called as an infrastructure as code. That is a concept that we'll be looking at, basically on how do you really create this out. How do you create your infrastructure and then deploy your code on top of it. But for now, what I'm doing is like I've already have a web application that is created in the Azure portal and just making use of that particular web application and doing a very simple release. But in real time, you'll be creating it firstly, because you don't want to basically do what you don't want to create it and keep it idle for a period of time, and then you incur cost and all that stuff. So now to reduce all this cost, you'll basically want to create your application when the code is ready, because there is no point in having just a sample application without having the code, right? So you would love to, or you would want to basically create it out. You want to basically create your application service before deploying the code, just before deploying the code, that's it. So that is known as an infrastructure as code. We'll also see how do you do that and all that stuff.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so I'm just like basically releasing my code, and the release pipeline, it kinds of takes like about 2 minutes or something. And what my release pipeline is doing is simple. It's just doing what my Visual Studio did. It's basically acquiring the connection to, let's say, the Azure web application. It's deploying all these things out there basically to the Azure web, on top of the Azure web app. And it said successfully updated the configuration of the Azure web app, and it's just giving a restart of the application. This might take a minute or two, so let's give it a refresh a couple of times. And once this is done, we'll go ahead and verify our application. We'll go into the Azure portal and we'll kind of verify how the application is like, kind of really behaving and all that stuff. So let's give it a minute. And since this is Azure hosted, it'll take some time basically in order to do all this process. It's a bit slow. But if I were to use, let's say, a self-hosted agent, this process wouldn't take so much time. It'll be like really fast. And let's see application. Actually, I have a feeling that it has already updated it. Yeah, it's done. Now it took like about 2 minutes 32 seconds in order to go ahead and do this entire process. It went ahead and it released all the code on top of my web application, and I said, okay, fine, this is like, good. I've like released it out and all that stuff. And now if I, let's say, browse this application out here, it should now basically show us the code that got really deployed on top of the application using the Azure DevOps. So this is our first release on top of, let's say, the web application using the Azure DevOps. And this might, take up time basically in the initial, startup. And this is the version 1 of the ASP.NET application released from Azure DevOps. This is how I can release my code onto a web app that is already created on the Azure portal. And now the advantage of this is that, let's say you release a version 2 and the code goes, let's say you're not using something called as a deployment slot. You have directly released upon the production slot, and now there is an issue with the code. How do you roll it back? You just take the older release. This is the release that went in for, let's say, release 1 is, this is the first release that went in for version 1, right? You can take this out and redeploy it. You can just do a redeployment. This will override, or this will basically have the artifact for version 1.0. This will be able to override the 2.0 and give you a 1.0 out here. So this is the best advantage, meaning you can version control your code. Meaning as in when you basically have like different versions of your code, you'd like to store all those versions somewhere. That's where Azure repository comes into picture. And you don't want this process to be manual. Meaning every time there's a new version of the code, you don't want someone to come, go to the Visual Studio, click on publish, click on all, do all that stuff, and then deploy it on the web application, because it involves a lot of human intervention, and you might face issues, meaning there might be human errors basically which are unavoidable. I'm avoiding all these things. I'm avoiding all these processes while using the Azure DevOps. So meaning I'm automating the entire software development lifecycle, and this is a very, very simple release. And this is called as a single stage release, guys. It's called as what? A single stage release, where I just took my application and deployed on top of, let's say, one particular web app that is running in a resource group called some XYZ in Azure portal. Now you will have something known as a multi-stage releases when you're working in a real-time environment. Meaning you won't have just one stage out here. You'll have multiple stages, and each and every stage will be called something like, for example, this is a development stage, which is the initial stage where you would want to basically release your code onto an Azure web application running out of a resource group called development RG in, let's say, the Azure portal, and you would like to test this out. So what I'll do right now is that I'll basically create 3 different resource groups called dev, test, production, something like this. So I'll say basically I'll do this manually for now. I'll say dev-rg, and I'll say basically this is easiest to review and create it out. And I will create an application called a development application inside this in a free tier. In, let's say, a free app source plan. So I'll say, okay, fine, this is a dev application to ABC000. and I'll say fine, this is ASP.NET 4.8, and I'll say basically this is ECS2, and I'll say fine, next deployment. I'll say disable. I'll say no for monitoring, and I'll say review and create. So I am creating something known as environments in Azure. I'm creating one particular application in an environment here. So I've created something known as a dev.rg, and I'm creating something known as a web application with the name called dev application 2abc, something like this. Now I'd like to create another environment called QA. So I'll say QA.rg. I'll say basically review and create. It's okay if it's an ECS or ECS2. I am not really that particular about it. And now I would say create another application called QA application and something like that. So I'll say QA web application 2abc000. Again, this is ASP.NET 4.8. This is ECS2 and F1, which is like good. And I'll say review and create this out. Meaning now I have like multiple environments. I have multiple web applications like development, like QA, like staging, and like production. So right now I only created two. Like this I can create staging and production as well. Now I want my code to be continuously deployed on top of all the environments, test it out, and then promote it to production. Meaning now I want to establish a full life cycle out here, like something like this. As and when my developer checks in the code to the repository, it should trigger something known as a CI pipeline, right? CI pipeline will give you something known as an artifact, and this artifact should be used with the release pipeline. And this release pipeline should take the artifacts to different environments. Like for example, I have a development, I have a QA, and imagining I have a staging, I have, let's say, a production. My artifact should go to all the different environments, be tested, and then basically promoted to production. Is this something that I'll be able to achieve with, is this something that I can achieve with Azure DevOps pipeline? Yes, you can. For which you should have something known as a multi-stage pipeline out here. What is a multi-stage pipeline out here is that I will add not one stage but multiple stages which are technically doing the same thing, which are doing an app service deploy out here. So what I want to do is I want to clone my existing stage. So I'll say clone, and I'll say this is not a copy of development, this is QA. And I'll do another stage called staging. And I'll do another stage called production. All the stages are essentially doing one thing. They're taking my code and they're deploying it on top of a web application. Now I'll say this is development. So I'll basically choose something known as a dev web application. And this is QA. So I'll choose something known as a QA web application out here. As a staging needs to have a web application like this. ECS2 is okay with me. And for production, I'll choose a web application called North Europe. So I have 4 different web application. I'm using 4 different stages out here. And I want to basically go ahead and release my code on top of all these 4 environments with one thing. The flow of the code is something like this. After the code hits, let's say, something known as a development environment, it will be basically going into something known as QA and then staging. And before it goes to production, before it actually goes to production, I want someone to approve the code. I want someone to approve the code promotion, because production is, let's say, a very sensitive environment which is directly exposed to the user. So I want all the tests basically to be conducted very thoroughly in all the lower environments. And this is something that I'm calling as an higher environment. And I want someone to approve this out. Usually your client approves this out. Or let's say you are an in-house project, the DevOps is an approval for this environment. And how do I basically set an approver is that you see this icon, right? So I just clicked on this icon and I said pre-deployment approvals. And I'll say, okay, fine, since this is I'm the only user out here. Let me see if I have any user with this particular name. Let's see what are the users out here. Let me go to the organization. Let me see what are the users in here. Yes, this is the only user basically that is there. So I'll say this is the only user though. So I'll basically let that particular user, which is me again, to go ahead and approve this code out. So I'll say save. So I'll say added stages and approvers. And now what I'm going to do is I'm now going to release my code out here. I'll say yes, all these environments needs to go. Like the code needs to go to all the particular environments, and I'll say create. Now I am doing a multi-stage pipeline wherein my code gets deployed to one environment, then automatically getting promoted to the other, then the third, and before it gets into production, it will ask me for an approval. Meaning now I am doing a multi-stage deployment. In here, I am firstly taking the code to the development application. After the code is going to the development application, it will go into the QA application. After the QA, it will go into the staging, and after staging, it will go into the production. Now, usually all these things, right, it will happen over a week, meaning one sprint. In one sprint, what I'm going to do is like I'll firstly release the code in development. I'll not immediately release it out to the QA like I'm doing right now. Rather, even QA will have something known as an approvers. Usually the lead of the QA team will act as an approver in the QA, in let's say in the QA environment. They will see if the code is being tested in the development thoroughly. They will see if the test cases are passed in the development. Are there any manual tests, etc.? If there are any bugs, have they fixed the bugs? And after the bugs are fixed, only then I'll go ahead and deploy it to QA. Now in our case, it's happening in a continuous deployment mode where development is done, QA is done, then staging will go, and then finally it'll go into production. But in the real-time environment, all this process, right, it will take at least like about 1.5 week, because each and every stage the code has to be tested. There are certain test cases for each and every stage that needs to be there are certain criteria for each and every stage that needs to be met. So once this is done, only then the code will actually go. But for our ease, for our understanding, I'm just giving you an idea on how the code promotion really happens out here. So development is done. I am thoroughly testing the code out in development environment. So if you look at my development web app right now in my dev.rg, I have something known as a version 1 out here. The code will now be running on version 1, and the same code is now being promoted to a QA environment. And even there, you have a lot of people, a lot of members of the QA team basically going in and testing their code out. And after that, you will have a staging environment wherein you will have the business coming into picture and telling, okay, fine, let me take over, let me test it. I have something known as a business acceptance test criteria to be followed. So the business will take the code from there after the QA is done. They will test it, and then they will give a sign off for production, wherein we, the DevOps engineers, or the client, if it's an external project, comes into picture and gives something known as an approval. So the code promotion to the production environment might not be a straightforward process. It needs to go through all the environments, be thoroughly tested there, and then only getting promoted into production. So this is the entire software development lifecycle flow, guys, using Azure DevOps. How do you release the code? And this is a very simple release on how do you basically go ahead and release this out. And as of now, I went ahead and manually created all these environments. And in the classes going forward, you will not do that. You will not really do that. You will see something known as a concept of infrastructure as a code. Now, if you see production basically is now basically stuck on an approval. And until and unless I don't approve it, or until and unless the client doesn't approve it, you will not be able to go ahead and promote the code into production. This is how the software development lifecycle actually works. Now see, I have released the code on multiple web applications without even having a human intervention in place. I did not even come into, let's say, the web application. I did not even basically use something known as a Visual Studio, nothing. Azure DevOps is taking care of all these things out. So guys, any questions till here? Anything till here? Are you all able to follow this out, or is there any confusions here?
Yeah, we are able to follow, but it need
Mhm.
some practice.
Okay. So any questions, guys? Anything else that I can take? Any questions that I can take?
How many DevOps guys will be there for a project in the company?
It depends upon the team size, Srikanth, really. There is no fixed answer for that. It really depends
Okay.
upon the team size. It really depends upon the number of developers that are there in a project. You can be you can be the only DevOps engineer for your project if, let's say, there are only like about 4 or 5 developers, one QA and one DevOps. They can be a project composition of that. And I've also worked in such a kind of projects where we had like about 20 or 30 DevOps engineers supporting, let's say, 300 or 400 developers. So it depends upon really the project composition out there and the number of environments out there. Now, this is a very simple environment where you have, let's say, like a development, QA, staging, and production. Well, I have worked with environments where we have, let's say, about 23 different stages, and each and every stage had different criteria, and each and every stage had different kind of a release that was happening. So there would be I mean, it all depends upon, it all boils down upon the size of the project, or the composition of the project again.
Okay.
Anything else, guys? Anything else?
So once this process is developed,
Mhm.
means there will be like a DevOps guy work will be very minimal. Like means sometimes no work will be there.
I won't say sometimes no work will be there, because we would basically look into something known as enhancing the ARM templates, giving a development support. Because I mean, in my experience, there wasn't even one day basically where I did not have work. Like there were days, especially in December and all, like you do not have the business basically that is running. But if there is a developmental activity, you will definitely need a DevOps engineer support, because development comes along with the infrastructure also. And sometimes you will have issues with the infrastructure, so you'll have to work with, let's say, different development teams in order to get that result. So this is one of the work what a DevOps engineer does. This is one of the things what a DevOps engineer does, like configuration of pipelines and getting them ready and all that stuff. But there will be some cases where your release is failing, so you'll have to identify why your release is failing, where your release is failing. Is it, let's say, an infrastructure issue? Is it a code issue? And then you'll have to give a resolution for that. So it's not the only work that we do. It's greater than this. Like you'll have security, you'll have enforcement and all that stuff. Now you basically see me basically copying this password like right now in my notepad, but it's not like this. You'll basically store it in something known as an Azure Key Vault, and then go for the establishment and all that stuff. So this is how you kind of do it out there. So this is just one of the work that we do. But after, I mean, post this, or including this, you have a lot of work, like, let's say, feature enhancements, and you do all that stuff out there. So there is some of the other work basically that you definitely have.
Okay.
Can we use these releases only for the web apps or any other things also we can utilize this?
Like you can utilize it for a lot of things. Like in the projects where I work, basically we use this release pipelines in order to create infrastructure, maintain the infrastructure. Meaning, let's say you have a lot of web apps and post 5 p.m. you do not want these web apps running, or you have a lot of virtual machines and post 5 p.m. you do not need these virtual machines running. Then we write a PowerShell script, integrate it into the Azure pipeline, and then release it out at, let's say, around 5 p.m. every day, schedule it out, trigger it out, and stop it. So even maintenance is actually taken care by Azure DevOps. And let's say we have a couple of databases, and database maintenance also goes through the Azure DevOps pipelines. And not only web apps, but let's say we have instances called EC2 instances that are, let's say, if you are coming from an AWS background, you would have been aware of it. Something called as EC2, which is, let's say, an AWS equivalent of virtual machine. So we'll also use Azure DevOps pipeline in order to release the code on AWS instances. We'll use Azure DevOps pipeline in order to release the code onto virtual machines that are running on IIS service, or virtual machines that are making use of IIS service rather. So not only web apps, you have a lot of features inbuilt to it. Like you have external third parties like Kubernetes and etc. Kubernetes clusters where we release the code onto. So it depends upon what do you want to really achieve out here using the pipeline out here. But primary purpose of the pipeline, yes, it is like releasing code onto, let's say, an environment. And in our case, the environment is, let's say, an Azure app service. Does that answer your question, Chandra?
Yes, yes.
Anything else, guys? Anything else that I can take?
Did you face any kind of the situation like after staging and approved at production, the application got failed?
Yes, a lot of situations, Srikanth, actually, a lot of cases where this will happen, where this is the reality. Because if the testing is not done properly, because testing is not your job, right? Testing is something that you don't do. Test criteria is something that, let's say, the development and the QA teams do it. And sometimes the testing is not done because they need the sprint to go on. And we have a couple of failures in production where we have to roll back the code back again. So we face an issue where basically we have released, let's say, a particular XYZ version of the code did not work. So we had to rely upon Azure DevOps and roll back the last known good release of it. So we do all that stuff also. So we do a lot of troubleshooting on the production environments too. Like where the code is not running, then we'll have to identify whether it's a code issue or whether, let's say, it's an issue with the infrastructure, and whether, let's say, you can basically involve the Microsoft team also in here and stuff like that. So yes, you will definitely face issues like that.
Okay.
Again, troubleshooting, it depends completely on what kind of an issue you are facing. Like troubleshooting is definitely not a straightforward methodology. You'll have to firstly diagnose what the issue is, and you'll have to see what the issues and all that stuff. We will also see the monitoring part of things. Like we also have a session for monitoring, and I'll just show you a bit of example on how you need to do a monitoring and all that stuff also. Okay, any further questions here, guys?
So approval will be at production level before going to production. Approval will be like from client side, or it will be from
Again, it
production
depends
developer.
upon, yeah, so it depends upon, let's say, whether you, if you have an external client as such. There are projects which are called in-house projects, which are internal to your organization. In that case, production environment is taken care by DevOps. DevOps is the sole owner of production environment. DevOps is the sole approver of production environment. In case you have a client, you can have multiple approvers, not one. But let's say multiple approvers here, where DevOps will give the first level approval, client will give the second level approval, and then the code will go into it. But in the real-time scenario, you'll have approvers for each and every stage. Even in the code, if the code has to go to the development, you'll need the technical lead of the development stage to go ahead and give an approval. You'll need the QA lead to go ahead and give an approval to the QA. You need the business to go ahead and give an approval to, let's say, the staging. And then finally comes the production. And all this process, as I said, it's not like straightforward process, like I release the code at 850 or release the code at 851, 852 in 1 minute gap and stuff like that. But in real time, it will not happen like this. If the code is going into development, the code is being thoroughly tested out in development for at least a day, and then bugs are identified and fixed it, and then the code is promoted to QA, and then the bugs are identified, resolved, all that stuff, and then released into staging, and then the bugs are identified if there are any. And staging to production usually doesn't take a lot of time, like we release it less than in a 6 hour period, because still here, if your code is like making till staging, it means that the code is thoroughly tested and then only promoted to staging, and then production basically is like usually smooth. Sometimes yes, you will definitely face issues, and you kind of have to troubleshoot that out. So to answer your question again, Srikant, it's like the business, the client, I mean for the approvers for the production stage at the client, or if it's an internal project, it'll be DevOps engineers.
Okay.
Any more questions, guys? Anything else that I can take? So before coming to tomorrow's class, guys, what I want you all to do is just practice this concept of multi-stage deployments. Like create a very simple release pipeline, take it for one stage firstly, use something known as a service principle, create a service principle like the way we did today, and only take it to one particular stage called a development stage. Then add multiple stages, add approvers to each and every stage, and see how it works out for you. And revise ARM templates, because tomorrow we are going to see how you are going to create infrastructure using the Azure DevOps pipeline by leveraging something called as an ARM templates, which is one of the most important things that we do, which is known as an infrastructure as code, which is one of the most important things that we do out there. So please go through that. Please go through the basics of ARM templates, because tomorrow we'll start creating an ARM template and integrating it with the repos, and then seeing how we take the ARM template and see how we create the infrastructure in each and every stage out there. So I'll be using the same pipeline tomorrow again. I'll be using the similar pipeline, but right now, instead of let's say just the code release, we'll also be creating the infrastructure. So we'll be doing a pipeline modification out here. Is that okay, guys?
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Okay. So please look at these concepts of ARM templates, and tomorrow's class is going to be really very important. So please do not miss it out. And we will look into more concepts of Azure DevOps and etc. Okay, if there are no more questions, guys, then I'm good to close the session for today, and I'll meet you tomorrow. Have a great day ahead, guys, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.